We've all heard of the Exodus from Egypt, but is there archaeological evidence to back it up? Let's see what our expert has to say. Welcome to our final episode of Faith Meets Fact.
Conflicts between archaeology and Torah usually arise because the Torah tells us about something that happened historically, and the archaeological record doesn't necessarily find anything to support that, or worse, finds evidence that contradicts it. Today we're going to look at 3 examples that demonstrate that the Torah's historical accounts are completely accurate, while at the same time, archaeology does not need to be discounted as a field of scientific inquiry. Let's start with Egypt. The Torah tells us that the Jewish people arrived in Egypt in the year 1523 BCE until God redeemed us with incredible fanfare in the year 1313 BCE. We would expect to find strong evidence of our 210 years as slaves in Egypt, or at least evidence of 600,000 male slaves and something like 2 million people who were slaves, leaving Egypt a smoking ruin. Yet we do not. It is the consensus of Egyptologists and archaeologists that there is no compelling evidence whatsoever that the Jewish people were ever in ancient Egypt, let alone slaves who left in some sort of miraculous exodus. That's to say that there is no compelling evidence that we were in ancient Egypt, but there's also no compelling evidence that we weren't. There's not much evidence at all, as a matter of fact. Because archaeology is the study of a small fraction of the crumbled remnant of what our ancestors left behind. With the bits and pieces that survived the ages, scientists try to piece together a narrative and paint a picture, with the understanding that the vast majority of artifacts will never be found. Archaeology has a limited ability to tell us what happened in any period in history, and no ability whatsoever to tell us what didn't happen in a period in human history. To put it bluntly, archaeologists and Egyptologists agree, not finding evidence for an event neither proves nor disproves its historicity. Pharaohs were very careful to not record military defeats. Furthermore, the entire site of Pi Ramses, where presumably we worked as slaves, is nowadays underground and very difficult to excavate. But the real kicker is that 99% of New Kingdom papyri are completely lost. That means when it comes to written evidence from that particular period of time, there's just not much. Since most administrative records from that period of time were written on perishable material that tends to decay, especially in the humid Nile Delta, the only written records that we have on papyrus from that period are wine vintage dockets. So when naysayers tell you that there's no archaeological evidence for the Exodus from Egypt, what they're leaving out is that there's no archaeological evidence for much of anything from that particular period of time. The current archaeological evidence neither supports nor contradicts the Exodus from Egypt, and therefore there is no conflict here between true science and Torah. And here the Jewish people can give no ground. Belief in the Exodus from Egypt being a literal event that literally happened when and how the Torah says it is one of the core tenets of the Jewish faith. The first of the 10 commandments is, "I am the Lord your God who took you out from the land of Egypt." An approach that, God forbid, reduces the Exodus to some ahistorical myth is entirely incompatible with Judaism. Moving on to our next apparent conflict, let's talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are a set of ancient Jewish manuscripts from the Second Temple period. They were discovered between 1946 and 1956, and they are widely considered to be a keystone in the history of archaeology, with great historical, religious, and linguistic significance. A percentage of the material in the Dead Sea Scrolls is incredibly vindicating for the Jewish people, very clearly matching the Torah that we have had for thousands of years. At the same time, the majority of what's in the Dead Sea Scrolls is deeply problematic from a Torah perspective. How do we explain that one of the oldest copies of our Torah appears to be different, vastly different, from what we have today? There are 2 approaches to this particular conflict, and both of them make a lot of sense. The first approach can be found in the writings of the legal scholar Rav Yoel Sirkis. I will remind you that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in a cave and partially buried. Rav Yoel Sirkis writes that any Jewish manuscripts that are ever found partially buried, completely buried, in a geniza, or otherwise being disposed of respectfully, should be highly suspect. It could be, says Rav Yoel Sirkis, that anything that we find buried that bears the markings of a Jewish manuscript was buried because we are required to bury manuscripts that are written incorrectly. Therefore, one strong possibility is that the Dead Sea Scrolls represent an incorrectly written Torah that was buried because it's incorrect. A second approach, and an idea that many biblical archaeologists are quite comfortable with, is that the Dead Sea Scrolls are not actually a religious text of the Jewish people as we emerged from the Pharisees, the group of Jews who always respected rabbinic law and can trace their practice of Judaism back to Sinai. Rather, the Dead Sea Scrolls are a religious work authored by a sect known as the Essenes, a group of Jews during the Second Temple era who broke off from mainstream Judaism, hid in the desert in caves, and practiced a sort of mystical contemplative Neo-Judaism that died out shortly after the destruction of the Second Temple. So when it comes to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have no conflict between archaeology and Torah, either because the Dead Sea Scrolls represent an incorrect piece of Torah that was ultimately buried in accordance with Jewish law, or because the Dead Sea Scrolls represent what a Neo-Judaic sect put together as their own private religion shortly before dying out entirely. Either way, the Dead Sea Scrolls are no conflict. What I hope we've demonstrated in these cases is that when archaeology and Torah conflict, this doesn't mean that archaeology is wrong, and it certainly doesn't mean that Torah is wrong. It simply means that we need to take a closer look at both of them.
Thank you for joining us through this series. This has been Faith Meets Fact.